I'm coming back for the Ruth Ware event. I'll tell you that. Well, thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm so thrilled to be here. And what a beautiful town you have. I love what they did to the McDonald's. All McDonald's should look like that, right? I thought what I would do tonight is talk a little bit, just describe the new book in case anyone's interested, and I hope you are. I wanted to share too where the idea came from. Often I'm asked, and I know a lot of other authors are asked, where'd you get the idea? And sometimes it's so mundane, but in this case, it was kind of a doozy. Then I thought I'd share just a little bit about how I became a full time author, which I'm celebrating my 10th anniversary doing that. And and then I thought I'd end just telling you just a tiny bit about my process because that's another question I often get asked by people who are thinking about writing. And there's just two little things I thought I would share that have made such a difference for me, but they're also very good just for life in general. So you might find them of value. First of all, the book, Between Two Strangers, is a story of a graphic designer named Skyler Moore who lives in New York City in the East Village, and she gets a call one day, goes to voicemail from an attorney. And as soon as she hears the word attorney, she says she gets that sense of dread you get when you go into an airport and you see one of those canine German shepherds and you think, did I actually swallow a condom filled with cocaine and not remember it? There's just something about that is terrifying when you hear from a lawyer. But she calls him back and he tells her, you've inherited something from a client of mine who just died. And there's a giddy moment where she thinks, okay, maybe life is finally going to take a turn for the better for me. But she doesn't recognize the dead man's name. But the lawyer says, no, I know you are the person. You need to come into my office and I can explain everything. She arrives and he tells her that the guy, Christopher Whaley, has left her a trust. And as she's talking to the lawyer, certain things begin to click for her. She realizes this is a man she had a one-night stand with 12 years before. She knew him only as CJ. She never spoke to him again. She did not know he was married, which he is. And he has left her $3.5 million. Now, there was a day where you had a one-night stand with a guy. You were lucky enough. If you were lucky enough, you were called Angel of the Morning. But in this case, she has inherited $3.5 million. And she's thrilled because it could mean that she can focus less on doing graphic design work and become a full-time artist and also have a child. She's almost 38, and this is something that's really important for her. But then his wife comes after her. She doesn't like the fact that Skyler has inherited this trust, and she's going to try to prove that she extorted the money from her husband. And Skyler has to figure out what's going on. She speaks to someone who knows the law who says, look, you have to know why he left you the money, because she has no idea. She'd had that one brief contact with him. But in order to protect herself, in order to make sure she gets the money, she decides it's got to be her mission to figure out why he's done this. And as she digs deeper about this person, she discovers other secrets that begin to put her life in jeopardy. So that's pretty much the gist of it. Now, where did this idea come from? Often when I do a book a year generally, as you heard, this is, I guess, my 17th fiction. And often I come up with something just based on a little germ of something. It might be a word I overheard or a headline. And often I don't even remember what that germ was because it explodes so quickly into an idea that I can't remember. But in this case, it was this really weird thing that happened to my family and I. When my mom died a few years ago, my brother, who was her executor, was waiting for one of the IRA checks to come in. And when he didn't get it, he called the bank and said, "Hey, shouldn't I have gotten the check by now?" And they said, "Yeah, a check did go out, but it didn't go out to you. It went out to someone named Susan Gray." And my brother said, "Well, we don't know a Susan Gray." And he calls me up and he said, "Do you think Mom had a secret we didn't know about? Is there another child? Some long lost daughter?" And finally, one of my brothers says, "I think that's the married name of one of our many time married relatives." So my brother, the executor, called her and she said, "Yes, I got a check from your mother's estate." And it was fairly substantial. So we all had a pit in our stomach. This money went to this relative of ours who was not a close relative. And she said, "Well, your mother always said she liked me." But it was very, we're like, huh. And my brother said, "Well, what did you do with the money?" And she said, "Well, I used part of it to renovate my apartment. And then I gave the rest to an orphanage." The old "gave it to an orphanage" line, right? But so we were really upset. And then it turned out it was a bank error. Her mother's name was, who was a customer, was not unlike my mother's name. And the bank wrote a check to us, gave us the amount that was owed us. And as far as we know, they never clawed back from the other person. And if you are a TD Bank customer like we were, you paid for that mistake, is all I could say. But it got me thinking about different aspects of that. And one of the things fiction writers often do that they talk about is they use the phrase, "what if?" And I found myself thinking, wow, what if my mother really had this secret? Or what if somebody left me money and I didn't know why? Or what if they left me money and I didn't know who they were? And all those what ifs finally led me to the story that I came up with. One thing that was interesting for me in doing research for the book, what Skyler has to do is part of trying to figure out why he left her the money. She wonders if there was something that happened that night, something he said that would be a clue for her. And she has to go back in time and try to think about what were some of the moments of that evening that might tell her something. And it's very painful for her because her younger half-sister disappeared that same weekend. And the book is a dual timeline, 12 years ago and present. And so I did a little bit of research on memory, which was fascinating. And it's not about recovered memories, but just kind of figuring out memories that you've just buried a little bit. And there's a lot of research that shows you can dig deep and somehow trigger certain memories. Music is a very clear trigger for memories, and it tends to trigger very positive memories. The biggest trigger, and we know this from books like Swann's Way, the Petite Madeleine, smell and taste are profound triggers of memory. And it's partly because, the parts of our brain that govern smell and taste are very intertwined with the parts of our brain that govern emotion and memory. And what the memories you have that are triggered by smell and taste tend to be older memories and some of them more emotional. What you probably shouldn't do if you're trying to trigger memories is sit with your romantic partner and reminisce about certain events. Because as you know, have you ever been to a dinner party where the guy starts bringing up something and the wife says, "That did not happen in 2009. No, that did not happen then. It did not happen there. That more interestingly is sometimes just sharing with people certain parts of life that you experience in a parallel way. I had something happen the other night that was so such a good example of this. There was a couple that was over for dinner, and we were talking a little bit about the Beatles. And these two guys, we did not grow up with them. One of them is French, but everyone talked about the experience of the Beatles in their lives. And so I found myself remembering so many different things that I had forgotten about simply because we were having that kind of discussion. So it was really kind of fascinating. With Skyler, what she ends up doing, because she's an artist, is she makes a collage based on elements from that night, with the idea that hopefully that will trigger certain memories. And indirectly, that ends up providing her with a critical clue that explains why this guy, Christopher Whaley, left her the money. I said I'd share just a little bit about my experience becoming a full-time author. I wanted to write from the time I was like 5 years old. And when I was 7 years old, and I promise I will not take you from 7 years on, but I had something really pivotal happen to me when I was 7. This teacher asked us to write something, a little story or something, I'm not sure. And I think she wanted us to use mainly, because you're not really writing very well when you're 7, she wanted us to use words I think she'd put on the blackboard. But I didn't do that. I wrote a little story about how my grandfather had taken me to see some ducks. And even as I was writing, and I thought, this is not what we were told to do, but I couldn't stop myself. Everybody got their stories back but me. And then I thought, oh my God, this is where the ducks come home to roost, I guess. I knew I had broken the rules and I was going to pay for it. But then she calls me up to read my story to the class. And then I still remember this. She mounted it on purple construction paper and hung it in the classroom. So that for me was such a profound experience. I guess a teacher wouldn't be able to do that today, single out a student, but it told me that by writing, it was rewarding. Breaking the rules was rewarding. And also just the praise that came from having written something that someone liked was fantastic. I was thinking about that story lately because at the very end, I remember I wrote that my grandfather started to drive the car away from the pond, and one of the ducks was in the road, and he leaned down. He got out of the car and leaned down to scoot the duck away, and the duck flew up in his face. And I was thinking, I appreciated a good twist at the ending, even at 7 years old. I knew that was important. So all through school, I wanted to write. I wrote, I put out a little magazine of my own. I loved magazines. I dreamed about writing suspense fiction because of Nancy Drew. Any Nancy Drew fans here? Oh, yeah. I loved her. I dreamed of I wrote for the school newspaper, dreamed about being a reporter. And I even wrote a play that was put on in my high school. But by the time I was probably a senior, I realized, in getting ready to go away to college, I had to pick a lane. You cannot be every kind of writer professionally. You have to pick some kind of lane. And when I was in college, I went to a school that had been all male for almost 200 years. And so I was in the first co-ed class. And I was picked to be their entry to the Glamour magazine Top 10 College Women Contest. And I worked my butt off to win that contest because I thought that could be an entree to the magazine world. And I won. I was also on the cover, which my brothers referred to as trick photography. But my lane was kind of picked for me then. So I still remember I worked upstate New York for a couple of months on an election. And then in November, I get ready to move to New York City to try to make it in the magazine business. And one of my brothers took me to the train station. It was this cold, raw night. And as we're standing there, I see him start talking to this older guy. And he brings the guy over and he goes, Cater, this gentleman's going to keep an eye on you in the train. I was so annoyed. It's like my brother's treating me like an unaccompanied minor. This guy stuck to me like a Velcro hair roller. He cups his elbow, my hand on his hand on my elbow. He helps me up under the train. Then he sits right next to me on the train. And I was just so annoyed. How did I get into this situation? And then I noticed everybody is staring at us. I mean, people were leaning down the aisles and looking at us. I thought, why? I thought maybe they're just wondering, why we're traveling together because we didn't look very connected. Got up to use the restroom, come back, and on my way down the aisle, I noticed there's an emblem on the guy's blazer that I hadn't noticed in the dark of the platform. And as I get closer, I see it says Green Haven Correctional Facility. And I realized, my God, people think I'm a prisoner being transported to a downstate facility. They're probably wondering, where the shackles were. But I arrive in New York. I got a job working at Glamour Magazine as an assistant, and I gradually moved up in the magazine business. And I loved it. It was fabulous. But around, I would say early 90s, I began to have this yearning to visit another lane. I wanted to try one of those other lanes I hadn't gone down. And the one I wanted to try was suspense fiction. I'm not 100% sure why it spoke to me so much. I know Nancy Drew. I'd always been, really intrigued by true crime. There's a joke I heard once that kind of sums it up. A woman goes to a fortune teller, and she pushes $20 to her and shows her a palm and says, tell me my fortune. And the woman looks at the palm, the fortune teller looks at the palm and says, no, I can't. The woman says, why not? She goes, it is just too awful. She goes, look, you've got to tell me, I can take it. So the fortune teller says, okay. I see a man lying in a pool of blood. He's got about 70 stab wounds. He's dead. And I think it's your husband. The woman kind of sighs and says, okay, just one question. Will I be acquitted? And I feel like that kind of sums up for me why I love mysteries. Did she do it? Why did she do it? Will she be caught? Will she be acquitted? So that kind of sums it all. So I decided I was going to write a murder mystery. By this point, I'm the editor-in-chief of Redbook, but I feel I have to try to go down this other lane. Well, I wrote 4 chapters, and I liked the way it was coming together. And then one day on a Sunday, I got a call from my boss asking me to come in and speak to her on a Sunday. And this was before bosses called you on Sundays like they do now. So I turned to my husband. I said, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm probably not the editor of Redbook anymore. I thought it might be bad news. I even said to her, look, please, if you're going to fire me, just do it on the phone. She goes, no. I arrive at her office. I had been out in Pennsylvania at the time. I had a pair of Keds sneakers on because I had no, professional wardrobe with me that weekend. And she sits me down and she tells me the company wants me to take over running Cosmopolitan magazine. I just couldn't believe it. It's a big money maker in the country, in the company. A huge women's magazine around the world. So of course I said yes. Didn't even have a cell phone then. It's not till I get home that I can tell my husband what happened. And I said, you are not going to believe this. I'm the new editor of Cosmopolitan. And he gets this big grin on his face. He goes, wait, I'm going to bed tonight with the editor of Cosmo? I think he thought I'd been handed the Kama Sutra at the meeting and told, learn every position in here between now and your starting date. And I was thrilled. It was an incredible job. It came with a big clothing allowance and everything. But I knew I was not going to have the chance to write that mystery. There was no way I could take over a job like Cosmo and make the time to write a mystery. And so I thought, gosh, that's it. It's over. So I put the 4 chapters in a drawer, and I said, maybe someday I can come back to it. Well, about 4 or 5 months later, it was Christmas holidays, and I got out the 4 chapters just to look them over, and I discovered something I had completely forgotten about. The dead nanny that I'd written about had been found on a copy of Cosmo. I thought, now, if that isn't the gods talking to me. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to try to do it. I had young kids, but I took them to school, and then I got into Cosmo by 8 o'clock. My staff, filled with Gen X and Gen Y, never got in before 9:30. So I tried to write 1 page a day. And then on weekends before my kids got up, I wrote a couple pages. And my first book ended up being a Kelly Ripa book club pick. And I wrote a total of 8 mysteries, thrillers while I was at Cosmo. So also known as burning the candle at both ends. But I finally, about 12 years ago, I just decided this is my shot at living in that other lane and seeing what that's like. And I want to do it while I still have the chance. And to anyone who's toyed with another lane, it's been a remarkable experience. So I told them I wouldn't renew the next, another contract after that. And so I had 2 years to sort of savor everything about Cosmo before I left. And then I left 10 years ago, and it's been just such an incredible, rewarding experience. And I owe it to readers like you who make it possible for me to work in a little home office and just have this very wonderful solitary existence, but I still have a lot of fabulous pals from my Cosmo days who work for me, and the wonderful tribe of mystery and thriller writers. They are very generous, fun people. Every year during International Thriller Writers Festival, which was last week, I give a dinner party for the same group. It was Friday night. And at my table Friday night was Karen Slaughter, Lee Child, Joe Finder, Lisa Unger, Alafair Burke, Lou Burney, and Chris Pavoni, who, if you haven't read Two Nights in Lisbon, is really a great book. And as I was sitting there, I was thinking, wow, this is so lovely that I know these people. And not this year, but another year, a few years ago, everyone was talking about Ted Bundy about the same time. I thought, God, I love being with my people who know Ted Bundy and really can talk about him and have an expertise in that subject. So I'd love to take questions from you. I just said it. I would close with 2 little things about my process that have been so helpful for me. One, I am a night owl. I just always was a night owl. After, I would get home at 5:30 from my job. I would have dinner with my family. And then after the kids went to bed, I would do another shift because Cosmo was not a 9-to-5 job. So I would put on Law and Order reruns and just sit on the couch and work for a couple of hours. But I discovered I couldn't write fiction at night. I had to do it in the morning. And a part of the process for me was discovering I was a morning person in terms of writing fiction. But one of the key things for me was dealing with procrastination. I had been a super procrastinator in my 20s, and I had tried to write fiction then, and I would tell myself I'm going to do it on a Saturday. I was single then, But invariably, I would find an excuse not to sit down at my desk and do it. I would find a rug pad sticking out from underneath the rug that desperately needed to be trimmed, sweaters that needed to be depilled, so many important things that had to be taken care of. So I used a technique, and this is something I use in so many areas of my life besides writing, that a time management expert told me, because I did a lot of pieces on time management in my 20s and 30s to help me conquer procrastination. But he was a guy who said that so often we don't tackle tasks that are really important to us, not because we're incapable of doing them and not because we don't really want them, but we make them too big. And he believed in something he called slice the salami. He said, you know how a big chunk of salami is so unappetizing, but if you slice it down, it becomes very much more appealing. And he said, when you have a task ahead of you that is not inviting enough, you need to slice it down to the size that it's going to be appealing to you. And I told myself, I think I could write for 15 minutes. I think that's the slice I can handle, that I won't resist. So for the first 6 months, I wrote for only 15 minutes a day. And then over time, I was able to make that more and more. And that was just an incredible tool for me. And it's funny, my yoga teacher, who I've been with for many years, she teaches aerobics too. And she told me that one of the interesting phenomena she's seen is, in January, when all sorts of people sign up for, after the holidays. She said the people who start off at 2 days a week are far less likely to be there in May than the people who sign up for 1 day a week. Same thing, they pick the size of the slice that's going to work for them. The other thing that I found really helpful, and a number of other fiction writers have told me they do this, including Karen Slaughter, is using a timer. Karen mentioned to me one day, we were just talking about tricks that keep our butts in the chair, and she said she uses a timer. And I read about this great technique called the Pomodoro technique. Have you ever heard about it? You use a guy who created it. He was just a student, but he called it the Pomodoro technique because he used a timer that's shaped like a tomato, those tomato timers. But he believed, and from what he studied, is that we really do good in 25-minute bursts, then with a 5-minute break. So he recommended you do something for 25 minutes, then give yourself a 5-minute break. And I found bringing the Pomodoro technique in a few years ago, I think particularly when I'd written so many books, and sometimes it's hard because you've been doing so long, you're doing a book a year. And I found the Pomodoro technique just absolutely saved my butt. So anyway, if either of you find yourself sometimes with a challenge about what to do, how to do something and get it done in a timely way, those things work for me. And I often love to share them because they were of particular value. So that's just a little bit about the book, about where that crazy idea came from. I am still speaking to that relative, but barely. And I haven't seen the apartment she renovated, but I guess it's beautiful. And a little bit about my journey and finding another lane, which has been, as I said, so rewarding. And if some of you have toyed with that yourselves, I highly recommend it coming out of the pandemic, finding a fresh lane and just exploring it a little bit. And I would love to answer any questions for a few minutes if anyone had any about any of you who might have thought about writing yourself and want to know a bit about that, or anything else I can answer for you. Yes. Wow. She asked, what do I think about AI influencing writing? Terrifying. And that was a big topic at International Thriller Writers, the conference last week. I mean, it is a real threat, and it's really the reason behind the screenwriters striking, because the big threat to them is that AI machines are going to do it. And I just hope that there is some collaboration, the people in the tech industry, to put some barriers up, because it's not just writers who are going to have a problem. We won't need accountants. We won't need all sorts of people if AI takes over without any boundaries. But I am going to try it just to see if I can come up with a better title for the new book. Yes.
What do you think? Are you have any of your books or series being produced into movies or TV series like your friend Karen Slatter?
Yeah,
does?
Karen. Oh my gosh. Karen, if you don't know, not only did Pieces of Her become a Netflix series, but Will Trent is now just been renewed for a second season for ABC. And, Karen has, that was something she wanted for a long time. And everybody the other night was talking about it at the table, where it's often when you least expect it, when you sort of give up wanting it to happen. For me, I didn't know. I should have dined out on this, but the Bailey Waggins books were optioned by ABC, Lionsgate, and a producer who I had lunch with. I didn't even remember to write him a thank you note, but it was Mark Platt who produced La La Land. And when I saw that him on the Academy Awards, I'm like, oh gosh, I should have run out and told people this was happening. I never told anyone, because then it kind of ran out of steam. They decided that Kristen Davis wanted to do a series that was about a detective, and in the Bailey Waggins book, she's a true crime writer, and so they went with that. And it just, you almost just have to tell yourself, hey, if it happens, great, but it might not, and that's not why you're doing it. I just got an email today from my film agent saying, wow, we really love this book. You'll get the list tomorrow of everyone who's reading it. So you always hope. Though Lee and Karen, because Lee Child, his Jack Reacher, they were saying that they call it night money because from the West Coast it comes in while they're sleeping. The emails say, you just got an extra such and such in your bank account. So night money. It would be nice to have some night money, but you can't do it with that in mind. And for every good one, there is Tom Cruise as Jack Reacher, right? And it's not what you wanted it to be. Though I remember Lee saying at the time that he sold 5 million more books after the Tom Cruise movies came out, but Tom Cruise wasn't anybody's idea of Jack Reacher, right? Yes.
You're very prolific. I'm impressed. How do you fight writer's block? You mentioned how you get yourself to the computer, to the table, but how do you fight it when just nothing's coming out? Does that ever happen to you?
Well, it's never happened to me, just as it's never happened to a couple of the other female writers I know who worked in magazines. Because what you learn in magazines is that you can never have writer's block. You can never wait for your muse. And what you do is you just get something down. And we would do the same things with cover lines. Now, I always told my kids, Mommy doesn't write the Cosmo cover lines. Those are written by somebody else in another location. But I would brainstorm with my executive editor on cover lines. And the first couple of days, we would be like, but you just kept at it. And the same with if you're writing the letter from the editor in the days when I was moving up as a writer in magazines, you just get it down and you know you can tweak it. And that is just the secret to writer's block. So everyone I know who came from magazines into fiction will tell you the same thing. I never get writer's block because you're trained to just push through. Now watch, tomorrow, thanks to you, I will just be like unable to produce a word. Yes.
Thank you. Being in the publishing industry, you probably had little or no trouble getting an agent. In fact, you probably didn't have an agent. For someone living in the middle of Ohio, it's slightly different. How do you recommend going about finding an agent?
That's a very good question because you need an agent. There aren't, like in the old days, slush piles that get read by very astute editorial assistants, and then it gets passed along to an editor. There were times, I remember the book Ordinary People, that was found in a slush pile. For me, what happened is I did have to pitch for. I'd written a nonfiction book first that was a bestseller called "Why Good Girls Don't Get Ahead, But Gutsy Girls Do." And I just pitched to a couple of agents. I did use my letterhead, so I knew that somehow it would get up to the top of the pile. But agents aren't interested in you just because you work at a magazine. They only want to go out with something they think they can sell. And that's why sometimes friends of mine will say, "Can I use your agent?" And I will say, "You're welcome to send to her, but there's just because you know me is no guarantee." So what do people do out in other parts of the country or who aren't in publishing? Are there places like Literary Marketplace that can explain where all the agents are and what genres they do? And then you write them very powerful cover letters, and you submit a part of the book. There's wonderful stuff online that tells you how to do a book proposal for fiction. And there's a woman named Jane Friedman. She has a website. She has a great one of her big articles on that website is how to get published. Very, very helpful. And I often send that to anyone who is looking for advice. So you learn how to create a proposal that even for fiction, you would include a section on why this book, why you are a good person to write it, your experience, your social media platform, which everybody is looking for these days. There's also, just one more thing I'll add, part of International Thriller Writers, they have a wonderful part of the conference that they call Craft Fest, where you come in and you take different workshops in how to write a thriller, what the key things are to look for, and then kind of like speed dating, they have agents that you pitch to. So it is a great investment for somebody who really feels like, gosh, I want to do this. Everybody and their brother is doing it, so why shouldn't I? And in fact, the whole world is filled in thriller and mystery writing with so many wonderful men, but particularly women in recent years, who I think saw Gillian Flynn and thought, I want some of what she has, the freedom to write at home, to be my own boss, to have a little bit of notoriety. And they're just wonderful women, and they all have had a lot of fun doing it. And some of them were lawyers, some of them were publicists, but they thought, hey, I've got a thriller in me. And a lot of them came through Thriller Fest. They went and they did the pitch thing. Agents will say, yes, send me your book. And so then they send it in. So I'm sure there are other things like Thriller Fest where you can do speed dating with agents, but that's a very effective way to come up face to face with somebody. A final question. Yes. Well, I read so many that I don't even know their names sometimes. But there are people that I love. Like I love Karen Slaughter books. I love Jane Harper, the Australian writer. Her latest Exiles I found great. I love the Ruth Rendell Inspector Wexford series because I feel she does what you really want to try to do, where you hide the killer, but you give great red herrings, but you also give clues, so the reader doesn't feel cheated later. And I love that. But what I find very inspiring often for what I do is literary fiction with a mystery at the core, like a Julian Barnes' Sets of an Ending, or even Atonement, where there is a mystery at the heart of it. And I think really so much great fiction, even The Great Gatsby, who was he? It has, at the heart of it, a mystery. So that, I guess I take inspiration from that too. Well, I probably shouldn't say that when I'm promoting, but there is one other lane, and thank you for asking. Since one of the first things I did was write plays when I was little, I have started studying playwriting, and I would just love to maybe not, it wouldn't even have to be produced, but just try to write another play. And I've been doing the David Mamet masterclass on playwriting, and it just, even if it just becomes something I learn, that is an interesting lane for me. And I think the pandemic sort of inspired me to think about. Do you feel that for you that the pandemic made you think a little bit, hey, what do I want the next 5 years? Where do I want to go? Do you think there was some of that as you came out of it? Was there one more question? Yes. Well, my kids are in their 30s now, but my kids have been so helpful to me with the books. They help me with the research. I remember one time I had my daughter Haley. I wanted to get the sound of somebody being followed in the woods, but not sure they were being followed. So out in Pennsylvania, I said, honey, I want you to follow mommy through the woods, but every time I turn around, I want you to hide. Okay? I don't want to know you're there. I just want to hear you. I want to know what that's like. So she was about like 8. So we're going through the woods, and all of a sudden I hear the crack of a twig, and I spin around, nobody's there. Walk for a little farther, and another twig snaps. Spin around, nobody's there. And all of a sudden, like, I'm getting nervous. So I have to remind myself, this is a person who carries a Little Mermaid backpack. You do not have to be afraid. But my kids help me with that. They read my books. They're always so supportive. And my husband has been incredibly supportive. Interestingly, he was a news anchor in New York City, and we met because one of the other college winners, Sheila Steinbach, she and I stayed friends, and about 10 years later, she moved back to New York to co-anchor the news. And she called me up. She knew I'd be watching that night because I cared so much about her, and she'd been over for dinner the night before. And so she calls me, and this whisper from the station, and she goes, when you turn on the news tonight to watch me, I'll be sitting next to the man of your dreams. I'm like, really? And first question, are you sure he's straight? And I said, why don't you want him? And she said, she's black, and she said, look, he's Southern. I don't know if he would be weird about interracial dating, so I'm giving him to you. So she immediately says to him, Brad, she's met him for 20 minutes. I know the woman of your dreams. But that is how I met my husband. So, but now he's retired, and he records audiobooks. So it's really funny. Our lives have kind of come together in this interesting way again after all this time. And but he's been a very, very good husband. And I don't think he reads every book, but he pretends he does, and that counts for something. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I so appreciate it.